Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the International Peace Institute. I'm Maureen Quinn, a senior advisor who focuses on South Asia. It's a pleasure today to have Ambassador Kai Eide here with us to share his perspective on Afghanistan and his assessment of the challenges and the opportunities facing Afghanistan and the international community. Ambassador Eide is well known to the UN community and a colleague to some of you, and so we're very glad to, I'd say, welcome him back to New York City, and of course welcome him here at the International Peace Institute. Ambassador Eide served as the special representative for the UN Secretary General in Afghanistan from 2008 to 2010, and he is here on the release of the English version of his memoir from that period, Power Struggle Over Afghanistan, an inside look at what went wrong and what we can do to repair the damage. Ambassador Eide is a very accomplished diplomat. Before going out to Afghanistan, he was the political director of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and in his book he has a great anecdote about a visit to Kabul before becoming the special representative of the Secretary General. His career included 3 tours at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, including as Norway's ambassador to NATO. From 2002 to 2006, the time period when, of course, the International Security Assistance Forces were being built up and deployed. In addition to his NATO experience, Ambassador Eide has had significant experience with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, starting from the early days of what was called the Helsinki process, and also as Norway's ambassador at the OSCE. What I think is important to note about Ambassador Eide is he's a diplomat who's taken on some of the most challenging diplomatic issues of the era. He worked in the Balkans. He was the Secretary General's special representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina. He worked on was part of the Mitchell Commission and contributed to the report that was done regarding the Palestinian Intifada. That was in the year 2000. And finally, of course, Afghanistan. So we're very pleased to have this opportunity to have him here today. I, of course, have had the chance to read the book, and before he begins his presentation and our discussion, I just had 2 impressions that I wanted to share. The first is it comes through very, very clearly that Ambassador Eide has a strong respect for the Afghan people, the Afghan voters who went to vote in the 2009 presidential elections, even under the threats from the Taliban. The respect for women and men who stand up and support women's rights. And of course, he also shares some experience he's had with youth in Afghanistan and his respect for the next generation of Afghan leaders. My other takeaway or impression, and what I thought was valuable, was looking at, reflecting on, so what are some of the root causes of the challenge and issues that face Afghanistan and the international community? So today, this is our opportunity to take advantage of his expertise and insights on Afghanistan and the challenges general of security, development, and governance. So I wanted to let you all know on a few logistical notes before I turn it over to Ambassador Eide and welcome him, is that this event is being webcast live. If you happen to be tweeting, today we've added the hashtag notes on our video screens if you want to tweet. And in addition, when we get to the question and answer session, please remember, hold the mic closely because that works for the live webcast. So with that, I'd like to ask all of you please to join me in welcoming Ambassador Kai Eide. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen, for your kind introduction. It's good to be here. I've been here in IPI events before, but not here, in fact, some years ago. The book that I just published is not an analytical work. I'm not particularly analytically gifted. so it couldn't be. But it is an account of my own experience, what I saw, including, I must say, an account of conversations that were not meant for the public, but I felt that so much had leaked over the last couple of years during my time there and after that I could also be a little bit more open than I would otherwise have been. So there are accounts of meetings, in particular with President Karzai, but also with other international and Afghan actors that I don't think you've seen before. Some will surprise you, and some will not. But I would like to say that it is my experience and seen through my eyes only. I called it Power Struggle Over Afghanistan. And why did I do that? Simply because I felt there was a power struggle, a constant power struggle, along so many lines. Let me just mention very few, so we all can see what a complex environment it was. The power struggle, of course, between the insurgents on the one hand and the government and the international community on the other. And then an internal domestic power struggle along several lines also, between the government and the opposition, inside the government between reformers and conservatives, a conflict where also the ethnic element became more prominent when I left and since I left. Third, a conflict between the Afghan leadership, President Karzai in particular, and parts of the international community that became more and more intense, and perhaps where we saw the turning point in that direction during my stay in Afghanistan. Then there was also a power struggle, I would call it, not with that intensity, between various parts of the international community, not least between the civilian part and the military part. There was, of course, a power struggle, maybe that word is not correct, but let me use it nevertheless, of a regional character, where the necessity to bring the neighboring countries in was obvious to all of it, but it was very hard. And then there was a power struggle also inside the government of a number of participating states, not least in the United States, as we saw in autumn 2009 when the final strategy, before the final strategy was, and the military surge was announced by President Obama. And then we had our mini power struggles inside the United Nations. I will not devote much attention to that. No, you're thinking of something particular now. That's my last point. In addition to this, there were some personal rivalries that some of you may have heard about, and that still seem to linger in books that seem to be appearing and that I don't recommend for your reading. So that's why I called it Power Struggle inside Afghanistan. And let me start with one element that I believe is more important than any other, and you may be surprised. It is our lack of ability to understand the Afghan society and the Afghan government and its leaders, and particularly also President Karzai. So many times when international dignitaries came to Kabul, I had to say, look, remember now, this is a country where 75 to 80% are illiterate. There is no strong institutions. There is very little infrastructure. When the elections took place, you know, we had to hire 3,000 donkeys to take election material to remote villages. There's no middle class to drive economic growth or to help strengthen the institutions. That's the society we're talking about. So when we try to establish timetables, calendars for progress, reviews, 3 monthly reviews, let's remember that we're not in a Western country. We cannot establish a timetable based on an election timetable, for instance, be it in the United States or elsewhere, perhaps in particular in the United States for obvious reasons. The clocks tick very slowly. Sometimes you have the impression they don't tick at all. And therefore, patience is required, and we were running out of patience. And then President Karzai himself. Who is he? Very often, visitors would come and be fascinated by his superb English, by his Western way of approaching his guests sometimes, with his knowledge of today's media in the UK and the US, which he had read in the morning. And we would think, this is a Western politician. Well, it is not. It is not a Western institution builder. It is not a man who seeks solutions the way we would expect from our perspective. It's a man who is deeply rooted in the Afghan tradition, and we tend to ignore it. It's a basic mistake. His way of doing it is what he was taught by his father, who was a tribal leader in Kandahar, a role that he took over from his father. And he traveled with his father. He saw how his father was doing it, both in Kandahar and in Kabul. He learned from him. He's the consensus builder, the coalition builder, sometimes shaky coalitions, but not the institution builder that we thought he was. That, to me, is of critical importance. He's also a man who found himself in a vulnerable position inside the country. Remember one thing, when we came in 2001, 2002, Karzai was without any instruments of power. He didn't have any civilian institutions that he could use to project power across the country, nor did he have any security forces. And you remember when he came to the airport up in Bagram and Fahim Khan was waiting for him there. Fahim Khan said to Karzai, "Mr. President, where are your men?" Because he came out with 2 or 3 advisors of the airplane. And Karzai turned to Fahim Khan and said, "You are my men now." Well, it wasn't that easy. Karzai did not have the instruments, and we did not help him establish the instruments, at least for the first years that went on. And that made President Karzai also extremely vulnerable, and it explains why did we have that turning point I mentioned in 2008. What happened? It was provoked, and it occurred when some very important incidents of civilian casualties took place. In August 2008 and onwards. One in particular where around 90 civilians were killed in a village called Azizabad in the western Shindan district of the country. That started the process that initiated a new phase, I must say, where the tension between the president and the international community grew. Why did it grow? Not only because this incident took place, but we denied it. Or at least the international military denied it. There hadn't been any civilian casualties. There were prominent Talibans that had been attacked. And then slowly, this denial reflex had to be abandoned, and we had to all had to recognize what we said in the UN also, that 90 civilians had been killed. But there was this denial reflex that was so devastating. And then we went on to the next step. Karzai said, well, okay, we have to get away from this situation. We have to improve the behavior of the international military community. And we can do that by agreeing on a new concept, so a compact between the Afghan government and the US and ISF on the other hand. Let's do that. Let's sit down and negotiate a new agreement between us, because the old agreement was from early 2002. There was no institution at the time, and very small ISAF force. So what happened was, when he took that initiative, there was complete silence. Complete silence from NATO, complete silence from the US, which to me was a dramatic mistake. What we should have done was to say to him, yes, Mr. President, you're right. We will, and we have to, we understand we have to accommodate you on this. But we did not. And it humiliated him. It was a demonstration of lack of respect. It gave him the impression that we believe we're in no man's land and not in a sovereign state. And of course, it made him vulnerable because it gave his constituencies the impression that he did not have control over his guests. he was not in charge. And that infuriated him and humiliated him. And it was not only these big events, but there was the daily intimidation that took place, and I have so many examples I can come back to later if you want. I experienced myself in the middle of center of Kabul to be stopped by international military. And I went out of the car and experienced to be at gunpoint with international military who saw my big UN plate on the side of the car. That to me is exceptional. And I had an apology. But the Afghans don't get that apology out in the villages. They don't get that apology. Fortunately, a commander came in summer 2009 who did his utmost to correct the situation. And his name is Stan McChrystal. He did a brilliant job. He did his best to try to reduce the civilian casualties. I know that he was sitting next to young drivers in military vehicles around in the country and saying, "Why are you driving so fast? You must respect the people here. Can't you see the villages?" It was a hands-on approach that proved to be effective in lowering the number of civilian casualties, and also, I think, the reputation of international forces. This all happened at the time when there was also a new administration in Washington. Let me say, George W. Bush writes this in memoirs, and he also told us when we were there, that he made a point of keeping in touch regularly with President Karzai by video conference to talk to him as a partner. And he said, "I provided advice, I never provided criticism, I never gave instructions or orders. But I wanted him to know that I saw him as the leader that he should be." Well, that is an approach that I wish all had been taking. And I must say, with all the expectations we had with the new administration coming in, some basic mistakes were made already at the outset, unfortunately. The video conferences were cut. There was no sign of any early visit at the higher level. A special representative was appointed, who unfortunately, in my view, and I'm sorry he's not among us and can participate in the debate, in my view, did not have the listening, desiring ability that the Obama administration said itself that would distinguish it from other administrations. It did not. We went into a situation with the election process moving forward, and where Holbrooke, and I was there myself at the time, so I remember in the meeting, where Holbrooke said, "Who can stand up against Karzai? What about Minister Atmar? What about another minister?" And went from one to the other, encouraging them to stand against the president. And of course, it was known to the president immediately. And what was the impact? The trust that had existed evaporated. That was unfortunately the start of that relationship. And it is a start that I believe, or a situation that I believe we have not quite gotten away from yet, although there is a different team. And I must say also, it was not so that the entire US administration was like that. Not at all. I have great respect, for instance, for the way the Secretary of State handled it, Hillary Clinton. I have tremendous respect for the Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, who always sought the quiet dialogue, and for others also. Gates then in two administrations, of course. Then the election process continued, and we have focused on the election fraud. I was criticized for that. That's all right. I had to live with it. I had my reasons for taking the stand that I did. But there was another part that did not receive the same amount of media attention, and that was the constant and blatant international interference in the election process. Constant and blatant. And when President Karzai says the international community stole the elections away from me in the first round, well, I looked at the figures. I looked at the candidates. Can I say that he is wrong? No, I can't. I cannot say the president is right, but nor can I say that he is wrong. And that in itself is a rather important statement for somebody who, from somebody who participated throughout the entire process. And it saddens me. Let me dwell on a couple of other important elements here of friction and, in a sense, power struggle between the Afghan community, the Afghan leadership, and the international community. I think we can learn from the first dimension. If you go in somewhere, do your utmost to understand. Do your utmost to show respect for the people, the culture, religion, the traditions that are theirs. It's absolutely critical and so simple, really, to say. The second is the way we handle the civilian aid that came in. Modest in the beginning, more ambitious as the years went by. But if you were there and tried, the way I was mandated to coordinate the civilian assistance, then you would have seen that it was an impossible task. Why was it an impossible task? Because countries did not report to the Afghan government nor to the UN what they were doing in Afghanistan. Out of the first $15 billion that came in, $5 million is unaccounted for in the Afghan overview of international assistance. We don't know where it went and for what purpose. How can you then coordinate? And furthermore, how can you coordinate when there is no priorities? You coordinate around a set of priorities. And gradually, I must say, we managed to develop them with the Afghan government and under the leadership of a competent finance minister. But we had one basic conflict going all the time. That was the international community's tendency to focus on rather short, quick impact projects. Not only, but to a much too large extent, on quick impact projects that were not sustainable, many of them. And the Afghan government, particularly its finance minister, said, please engage in sustainable development. When you build schools and clinics and roads, I need money in the future to finance that. Because when you leave, and it can happen any moment, then I need a budget that can finance it. And it took a long time before we understood and started to adjust ourselves to paying more attention to sustainable development, agriculture that had been neglected for years, infrastructure, railroads that are needed, that we are now embarking on, power lines that are so critically important for any economic growth. The Afghans had to move out of the aid dependency situation they were in. They're still there, but I do hope that we are at least setting another trend. I'm coming closer to the end. I can see, even not looking at you, I can see you're getting impatient. The civil-military power struggle, and I will call it that. I was tasked by the Security Council to develop a comprehensive concept. And the Bucharest ISAF summit, the ISAF summit in Bucharest, said there's no security without development and no development without security. That's great. Doesn't give you much direction. And then we got on the ground. Everybody agreed on this comprehensive concept. And we got down on the ground and found out that it was not so easily doable after all. Because what actually happened? The military building up their forces, becoming more and more impatient, wanted to have the civilians on board as an appendix to an increasingly militarized strategy. That's what happened. Increasingly militarized strategy. Wanted us to come with them out in the field. Work with them, armed soldiers, unarmed UN personnel or NGOs, and be, as one prominent general, like I think it was Petraeus said, one team in one mission. And the NATO Secretary General, the current, said there has to be a cultural revolution among the NGOs. It's not that simple. I understand the military's concern, but do understand the legitimate concerns of the civilian aid community and the NGOs. They cannot be seen as being part of the battle. They need to be able to move freely as possible in a difficult security situation across the country. They aren't armed, although they go unarmed to places where most countries do not send their armed forces. They need to protect themselves, and they need to protect their projects. And they have a completely different culture. They don't have the chain of command culture. They have something else, something more horizontal. They have a different perspective. They have a longer-term perspective, not the short-term perspective. It's almost impossible in a situation of a hot conflict to develop this kind of comprehensive concept. And I think we agreed gradually that yes, we had to work together, but we had to respect the differences between us. Finally, reconciliation. The buzzword, fortunately, because in 2008, I must say this, because I'm proud of it. In early 2008, just after I was appointed, I said there has to be a political process, and we have to involve the Taliban leadership. I didn't say Taliban leadership, but media asked me, do you want to involve the Taliban leadership? And I answered, look, if you want relevant results, you have to involve the relevant people. If you want important results, you have to involve important people. You can't talk about discussing with non-ideological Taliban or local commanders. It's not going to work. That was our thinking already early 2008. And I'm very pleased to see that although it has taken quite some time, this is what almost all of us think now. Almost all of us. I think we all recognize, as in many other conflicts, you cannot solve this by military means. You cannot. The military means are important, and I was not against an increase in military forces, but I was against an unbalanced approach where the political and civilian components were thrown aside. And I'm pleased to see that perhaps, we are in a situation.
This is your fire safety director.
Are you sure?
We are doing a test of the fire system. So all alarms are notified. Again, we are doing a test at this time. Thank you.
All right.
You're all right.
Well, what is being tried now with regard to the reconciliation process is not a test, I hope, but is real. And let me add to that, we're in the very early stages, and we don't know if it will succeed or not. We must certainly not be seen, the international community, and I spent 11 years at NATO, so I see it a bit from that perspective also. We must not get into a situation where we portray the impression that we're leaving, so we have to talk. That will be detrimental to any serious peace process. The two components must be calibrated well with each other, and therefore I'm pleased to see that we're now not talking so much about clear, hold, build. We're talking about fight, talk, build. And for me, the talking is important. And we have to demonstrate that the priority is the talking. And we should do that via confidence-building measures that can demonstrate our readiness from the international community and test the readiness of the other side. I said test, and that triggered it all.
It's helping to make your point.
Yeah. And then let me move on from there to say what is then required in order to have a successful process. And we are now in the very, very early days, perhaps. I don't know, perhaps. First of all, we say it over and over again, but we don't quite do it yet, and it's very hard because the Taliban don't want it to negotiate with the Afghan government. But there is no other way. The United States or NATO or anybody else, international, can't make peace in Afghanistan. We can address some of the components, perhaps. But peace in Afghanistan can only be made by the Afghans themselves. And therefore, the Afghan government has to be brought on board. And we have, those who talk to the Taliban have to say, that's how it should be. We're not going to make peace with you. Peace has to be made with the government. It's not easy, but we have to insist and not try some kind of shortcut that's not going to work. Second, we have to help bring about a national consensus in Afghanistan. It doesn't exist today. President Karzai is under pressure from reformers who fear that the achievements of the constitution will not be respected, and it's legitimate. And we have to do our best to ensure that it doesn't. But it's also under attack from people with other agendas, from other ethnic groups. And he has not been able to forge a national consensus. And I think we have to say to these people, and the big international players have to say, we expect you now to form part of that national consensus. Because who are these people? Some of them, to be quite honest and brutal, are people who worked with the US and worked with NATO in the early days. In late 2001, and through that cooperation were brought back into power in Kabul. Some of them are warlords that we have never really tried to marginalize, but we have enriched them, paid respect to them, etc. And we should say to them now, we expect you to participate in creating a national consensus. And then the third difficult element is, of course, the regional context, the neighborhood. The neighbors have to be brought on board in one way or another, be it Pakistan or Iran. They cannot be ignored when you try to seek a peaceful solution to this outcome, to this conflict. It is simply impossible. They do have legitimate interests. They do have concerns. And they have to be taken into the equation. It's very difficult, knowing that, for instance, right now, the relationship between the United States on the one hand, and Pakistan and India and Iran is more complex than perhaps at any time during the last few years. But it is necessary. I think I should end there. Am I optimistic or not? It's very hard to be very optimistic after having spent a few years there and seen how we have not reacted with the speed that we should have. We've lost a lot of time. Can we regain it? I do hope so. And I take some comfort from seeing that the basics here now, which is to put the Afghans in the lead, to engage in a peaceful, in a dialogue, in a reconciliation dialogue with insurgency, those are elements that we all agree on. So we have a situation where we can proceed on a different basis than we could only a few months ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kai. I think you've really covered the whole range of issues. Practically, certainly you've talked about elections and governance, development, and donor coordination. I want to start with a question, and then I'll turn to the audience. One topic you did not touch on, but you do write about it in the book, is about corruption. And in the book, you write that President Karzai blames corruption on the international community rather than the Afghan government. And you write that you disagree. So could you talk a little bit about your view on the sources and the impact of corruption? Thank you.
I disagree. Thank you. I disagree when he says that Afghan corruption is only petty corruption. I think there is grand-scale corruption on both sides. When we talk about petty corruption, that is, for instance, a police chief or a district governor taking $10 for a stamp. That's not petty corruption for the family with $60 in income. It's not petty corruption. It's felt, and it angers the local population. It creates distance between the government and the people instead of the opposite. But I think we have to admit that both the international community and the Afghans are engaged are involved in projects that I would say amount also to corruption. We do not have the sufficient accountability and control mechanisms with all the money that flows in. We don't have it. We simply don't. Money disappears. Where does it disappear? district governors, provincial governors, perhaps even to the insurgency. It certainly disappears in contracts with warlords and power brokers that we've entered into, the international community has entered into. Karzai also believes that some of our practices that we don't see as corruption is corruption. When somebody is hired, a Western expert, or an expert is hired from Western country and paid $500,000-$600,000 a year, and he sits next to an Afghan who earns $1,500 a year. This is seen as corruption. It's not corruption. It is seen as corruption by the Afghans. It is seen as a kind of corruption when we have a technical agreement between ISAF and the government, which allows the commander ISAF to determine who should be tax exempt, and where even little subcontractors do not have to pay tax to the authorities, which means that significant amount disappears from the budget. They see this as corruption, and perhaps they have good reason to. So that's why I believe both have to look at what they're doing here and see to it that it is not corruption, and that we eliminate procedures that are seen as corruption and that angers the Afghan people and leads to loss of money.
Okay, so I'm going to open to the audience to questions, and what I'll probably do is bundle questions, given the size of the audience and the range of the topics. So as I said previously, please have a microphone. Hold the microphone relatively close because we are webcasting it live. And I'll take, usually 2 or 3 questions. We've got 2 I see already. And then turn it back over to Ambassador Eide. So there in the back we have 1, and then 2 in the back, I see.
Thank you. Ambassador Eide, I'm Jeff Laurenti with the Century Foundation. Over the past 10 years, we have made a substantial investment, that is we, the international community, in trying to build, as you said, what isn't natural for President Karzai, institutions on the scaffolding of what had been the Northern Alliance resistance back before the fall of the Taliban regime. To what extent do you see these institutions, these what we might call democratic habits, practices, beginning to take root such that absent foreign troops being there to, quote, hold it together, these institutions don't just melt away like the morning frost, and you revert to the multiple factions that had characterized Mujahideen rule in Afghanistan in the earlier part of the 1990s?
Ambassador Eide, I'm Christina Koch. I was actually your staff member in Bosnia many moons ago. I say that because that's a relevant part of my question, actually. It's not a new thing for the UN to collaborate with NATO in various theaters of operation. We've done it in Bosnia, we've done it in Kosovo, and we did it a bit in Libya as well. What is it about Afghanistan that makes it so much harder? And given the evolution of the relationship between NATO and the UN in Afghanistan, how do you see the future of that collaboration?
Thank you. Jeff, first may I compliment the Century Foundation on an excellent report last year. And I agree. I agree with these recommendations, and I wish that others would also. Which means that instead of having 10 would-be peacemakers in the international scene, there could perhaps be 1. It would make things easier for all of us. But with regard to civilian institutions, well, I would perhaps partly disagree with you. I don't think we have invested what we should in development of civilian institutions. If you read Jim Dobbin's book, this is one of his major complaints very early in the process of 2003 and so on, where he says, I asked Washington to invest in building civilian institutions that could help Karzai project power. We didn't. Then slowly we started to engage more in governance issues, but in a very fragmented way. very fragmented way. The Germans had their little governance programs in the northeast, the Italians in the west, the British in the south, the Dutch, etc. Everybody had their little governance projects. But there was not one concerted effort to build Afghan institutions at the local level, nor, I must say, at the central level. So we could perhaps have been further along the road on building institutions than we actually are now. And I think to avoid the situation that you are referring to, more money has to be spent. And I must say, I believe that there is a change also here in the international community, that we do understand that if we want to build Afghan institutions, we have to build it the same way across the country. And there was, during my last couple of months, for instance, a greatly increased interest in the Civil Service Institute that was built by the South Koreans, and its branches in 32 of the 34 provinces. So things are happening. Democratic practices. How long did we take to make sure that democracy had really taken root? Quite some time. And we've taken quite some time, more than decades, to make sure that our democratic systems work. And sometimes, nevertheless, they don't. So what do we expect here? It's going to take time. And this is interesting because when we see the way Karzai operates, yes, he has to relate to the other institutions that have been put in place, but he also relates to the other structures. He relates to the tribal leaders, to the religious leaders, to the warlords and power brokers that none of us have really tried to marginalize. And he has to relate to them. Forging a government in Afghanistan means trying to bring everybody in, co-opting everybody. And if you do that, you risk being co-opted yourself, you know. Karzai has to operate in two worlds at the same time. His own traditional way of governing and the new democratic world. That's very, very hard. Gradually, it will shift towards the new institution, but it will certainly require time. Oh yeah, sorry. Did I spend that much on first question? That's, cooperate with NATO. It's good to see you. I spent 11 years at NATO, 11 years in 3 periods. And I have great fondness for that organization. I think I also see the limitations of military power. By the way, General Eikenberry does also. We're in complete agreement on some very basic issues in Kabul. What was different from Bosnia, Kosovo, Libya? Well, Libya was a very special case, I think. And what was different from Bosnia and Kosovo? Well, there were some very brief campaigns, military campaigns, before the signing of the Dayton, the negotiation and the signing of the Dayton Agreement, a tremendous achievement by Richard Holbrooke, a tremendous achievement. And in Kosovo, there was a brief air campaign. But when that air campaign was going on, there was no activity by other international organizations, or very, very little. Humanitarian, perhaps, yes. So we didn't operate as we do now in a hot environment, in a constant conflict environment. And that's what makes it so difficult. Now, I'm sure that military forces and civilians can work well together in a peacekeeping environment, post-conflict environment, as we did in Bosnia and elsewhere. But in a hot environment like this, it's a completely different story. And the civilians have to protect themselves in a very different way. The integrated approach may work in peacekeeping, but it doesn't work in a conflict environment.
I think I saw questions over on this side of the room. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. I just was wondering if, well, I was wondering how you would view the implications of a drawdown of the international military presence in Afghanistan on aid in absolute terms, and how that might affect the role of the UN in mobilizing and coordinating assistance. And I ask that partly because the say Paktia province, where I was working last in Afghanistan, the U.S. PRT had a budget of about $100 million per year to disperse, which dwarfed any other assistance, civilian or military, coming to that province. And its withdrawal, which I would expect to follow the withdrawal of a PRT, would have pretty tremendous implications for the resources that are available for that particular province. Now, we can obviously question how effective military assistance is, what sort of priorities it has, but in absolute terms, it does seem like there would be a major shortfall. Thanks.
Justin, you are?
And Vikram Parekh from PBSO, and also former staffer of Guy.
Not from Bosnia.
Warren? You had a question.
Warren Hogue, IPI. I wanted to ask you about these incipient talks in Doha. From what you said this morning, I can't imagine you're too optimistic about them, because not only do they not seem to be involving many Afghans, they're happening pretty far away from Afghanistan itself. My question is, do you see any way where this vehicle, which is the only one that seems to exist right now, could be turned into an effective negotiation between the Afghans and the Taliban and outsiders who are interested?
Vikram, I think your question is very important. I think this quick surge and the quick withdrawal, so to speak, will also mean that the military bring lots of money in and bring it out again. There are different components here. One is with 10,000 or 20 or 30,000 additional military, you employ thousands of Afghans, use probably hundreds of transportation companies, etc., etc. So there's a significant amount of money that starts circulating in the Afghan society. And then that disappears. That's going to have an impact. And the World Bank has in fact worked on this. And then you see the withdrawal of forces that have been there for a longer period of time, on whom the Afghan society depends even more, of course. You see also that some countries who are preparing to leave from the south will take with them their civilian financial resources. So it's going to have a significant impact on drawdown of donor assistance, I'm afraid. I do hope that some of the participating states will say, well, we are reducing our military forces, so we'll step out our civilian assistance. And I see it happening in perhaps one or two countries, but it's not a trend. So what we could fear, in fact, is if this continues, and if we see a worst-case scenario evolve, that Afghanistan could go into some kind of economic recession, that the growth rate may be seriously reduced. And that is certainly what I think the World Bank is warning against. You said, how will it impact the UN in coordinating assistance? As far as I heard, I don't want the UN to coordinate assistance. I want the Afghans to do it. I think they're better placed. I think it was wrong to say the UN should do it. We don't have the capacity. We're not going to do it for many years, you know. We will have to do it for a brief period of time and then hand it over. Why not hand it over now? We're saying the Afghans are not mature. Well, then how will they become mature? By doing it, of course, increasingly. And I must say, from late 2008, early 2009, we saw more reform-oriented people coming into the government. The Minister of Finance, Minister of Mines, Minister of Education, Minister of Agriculture, Minister of Interior also at the time. But these were people who had a strategy, particularly the Minister of Finance, and who are able to implement it. So I think time has come, and I think most international donors realize that. Time has come to give the Afghans responsibility. That was the gist of the Kabul conference, and I hope we follow that agenda. The Doha talks, I don't know. I haven't been to Doha for a while. And certainly these other people were not there when I was there. But I do hope it's serious. And so much has been written about it. I think it will be a setback if it proves not to materialize in any way. But let's just be prepared that it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. What we see is possibly, and I say possibly, the first steps. Yes, there has been contacts for quite some time. We had our first contact in 2008. But they have never been regular. They're extremely sporadic and different kind of channels. But to establish a permanent channel and a regular dialogue is going to take quite some time. So I don't think we are there yet. But I think if we don't involve the Afghans, I think we will increase the tension that exists between the Afghan leadership and the international community. We see President Karzai today saying, don't bypass me, don't bypass me, because this is the most critical political issue that the Afghans are facing. And we must not say Afghan-led and then not seeing to it that that becomes reality.
Okay, we have one question in the middle of the room, and then I'll come back to the front. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Erin McCandless, and I consult with various UN organizations. I really appreciated all your comments about the context, the importance of understanding the context. I was one of the evaluators of the UNDP, the Assessment for Development Results in 2008 in Afghanistan, and at the time we were struggling because there was basically no conflict analysis, no comprehensive conflict analysis that organizations were working from, which was pretty shocking given that it was 2008. And I'm just wondering if you have any insights into how you think UN staff could be much more aware of the conflict, have a much better conflict analysis earlier in these settings, and also of the wider context, whether it's having an in-house anthropologist or what else could be done, and then just to I guess draw you out a little more on the aid coordination mandate. I mean, are you suggesting that you think the UN should never have this mandate? Should it not be the SRSG? Should it, usually the triple hat DSRSG has more that role. Or are you just suggesting that Afghanistan is now at this stage, or was a little while ago, where it should be turned over? But what about early in a post-conflict setting? Thank you.
We have two questions for sure in the front, and in the front row we have. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank you for this excellent presentation. It was really quite marvelous. Thank you. There's a subject that seems to have dropped off of the radar screen in recent months, actually a long time, and that's the poppy cultivation. And first of all, I wonder why it's no longer discussed. Is it because it's diminished? My impression is that it isn't. Or is it purposely avoided, the subject purposely avoided? And secondly, I'd like to know how the drug trade and the cultivation of poppy is impacting all of these efforts. I mean, I know that it had a very deleterious effect in terms of feeding insurgents and so forth, but is it impeding in the peace process? Oh, I didn't give my name, I was told. Ann Phillips, I'm a member of the board of IPI.
Well, UN staff, greater awareness. I think we have people here in the front row who could probably elaborate on that more than I could. And who work with these kind of issues regularly. But I think what you're mentioning, to have experts, to be able to have a little bit more training before you go to the field, I think will be good. I myself, what did I have? Very little. I had been to Afghanistan almost every third month since September 2003, but on short visits only. I'd read about Afghanistan since the 1970s because I thought the struggle between the fractions of the Communist Party was fascinating. And then came the Soviet invasion and so on. But I didn't have any training about the context. And I think we have to all devote more attention to that, all of us, in the future, because we need to know where we are and who we're talking to, and we don't. Now, I must say that I believe that the UN is better placed than most in that respect in Afghanistan, because we have a very significant number of Afghan staffs that provide some insight into the society, and more than glimpses, but some insights. We also have some extremely competent staff that are themselves Muslims, know the languages, have been there for many years, and I admire them tremendously, and who can teach us about the country. And we try to make the best use of that we possibly could. On the other side, you have the international military that mostly stay in their compounds or move in very heavily protected ways, have limited contacts to the society. I'm not going to say none, but limited, and not in the same kind of regular way that the UN had. The embassies didn't have that kind of asset that we had. So I do believe that we were better placed than most, in fact. Then you said, should UN never have had that mandate on aid coordination? Well, perhaps. It may well be. At least I thought, when I got the mandate, because it happened when I came in March 2008, that it was made more precise. And Tom Gregg, my first special assistant, came with me to the Canadian delegation for a meeting of group of friends, that it was called, ambassadors. And one of the ambassadors asked me, Mr. Eide, how long time do you think it would take before we can see some improvement in the aid coordination? And I said carelessly, well, I guess a few months. It'll take a few months. And we got down on 2nd Avenue again, and Tom Gregg grabbed my hand and said, you mustn't say that kind of thing. It's going to take much longer, because the UN did not have the experts. We struggled to get aid effectiveness experts. We didn't have the power to put it that way. We couldn't say to donors, do it like this, do it like that. We tried to name and shame donors, And some ministers of development came to me and said, we don't like what you said when you visited our capital. You said that it's wrong for us to spend 50% of our assistance in the province where we have the military. You shouldn't say that. I said, well, it's true. It's true, so we have to say it. That's my mandate. It didn't have any real impact, and the reason was that we didn't have any priorities set, which means we didn't have a strategy, and that developed gradually through 2008 and 2009. But I do believe that in this kind of situation, the sooner you can hand over responsibility to the locals who have capacity, who happen to know their country is theirs, the better will it be. The poppy question. I try to avoid that. Why did you remind me more? You said to me that if we bundle questions, you don't have to answer all of them. You can just duck some. I said that yesterday.
Yeah, well,
it was at a different event. But I will take it.
Thank you.
I'll take it. I embarrass you now. I'm sorry. She was joking with me yesterday. But in 2008, 2009, wasn't it? You saw a sharp reduction in poppy cultivation. It had partly to do with better governance. There were more governors, more religious leaders, etc., who came in and said, don't do this. That was one component. The other component was better support for farmers who wanted to switch to different crops. But I must say, I believe that the perhaps most important reason for the drop in poppy production was the drought. And it went in a couple of years from 8,400 metric tons per year down to 6,600 tons. And I think it continued to go down the following years, but I saw that this year, in 2011, it's gone back up again. And it has to do with a number of things. It has to do with the conflict, it has to do with the climate and the weather, and a number of other elements. What's the impact? Of course, you mentioned that it was feeding the insurgency. Of course it does. But it also creates crime, pure criminal gangs, criminal activity that have little or nothing to do with insurgents. And it fuels corruption in the Afghan society, even at the level of authorities or people that are in the in government structures. So it's going to be. I believe you will never manage to really address that before you have a peaceful solution in Afghanistan. Simply not possible. By the way, as far as I know, and somebody may correct me, when I came in, the annual production was around 8,000 metric tons per year. And I believe the annual global consumption is about 4,000 tons. Only half of what was produced in Afghanistan, which means a lot is in stock somewhere, hidden somewhere. Where is it? I don't know. But it shows also that there is a certain market flexibility here, you know, that those who are in charge can make use of.
Okay, so I know John has been waiting quite some time, and then in the second row. Thank you.
John Hirsch from IPI. First of all, thank you very much. I join Ann's remark. As we all know, U.S. forces have left Iraq, and the future is uncertain. It's almost very likely that NATO and U.S. forces will leave Afghanistan in the next several years. Don't know if you agree with that, but that seems to be a general assumption. In fact, President Obama announced 2 nights ago he was bringing 23,000 troops back this summer. So rather than asking you point blank what you think will happen after they leave, I'd rather ask you, what do you think needs to happen in the next 2 years in Afghanistan so that some outcome that you would regard as acceptable would be in place following the departure of NATO troops? And what is your assessment of the prospects for these requirements to be achieved in these 2 years?
That's nasty.
But that's kind of, you know, it's out here as a challenge. You know, people in the U.S. are very concerned that a decade of military involvement in Iraq has left a very problematic outcome. All the people who've died, all the money that has been spent, right? Everybody in this room probably worries about those things. So I think the same kind of concerns would apply to the decade-plus presence of U.S. troops and other troops. You know, this is more than World War II in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you. Shamina de Gonzaga, World Council of Peoples for the UN. My question is that I feel like what's often missing in the equation is voices not just of Afghan leaders, let's say from different factions, but actual civilian voices. And it strikes me that with all of the funds that are allocated to these multiple projects that you yourself referenced, a pretty low cost comparatively and high impact approaches to provide civilians with outlets for communication. I know of a lot of independent photojournalists, artists, and others who are dedicated to doing that. I'm wondering if some of the NGOs you mentioned who are willing to have a sustained presence in areas where others are not, or what strategies might be enabled so that regular people from Afghanistan could have a chance to convey their reality, speak to the impact that they're seeing on the ground, sort of play a role in holding both the international community and local authorities more accountable. Thank you.
Well, you said next several years, you said. You didn't say 2014, 2015, 2016. You said next several years, and that made it a bit easier for me. Because if you had said 2014, I would have been extremely worried. Now, the timetable is, of course, withdrawal of all non-combat forces by 2014. And what you see now with the 23,000, in addition to the 10, means that the 33,000 forces that went in and were announced on the 1st of December 2009, they will then be out. And then I think 17,000 came in early in 2009 for the election process, that will then also slowly, I guess, with other international forces be withdrawn. And you see also the same dynamic in Europe. And in Europe, of course, the number of forces that you contribute is much lower, which means that the impact when you start withdrawing on your own force level, your own efficiency is higher. I do nevertheless hope that it will not be all calendar driven, that it will also be driven by developments on the ground. Developments on the ground, I mean several things. One is that we see a process of reconciliation initiated and underway. I happen to believe that there will be a need for international military forces throughout such a process. The Taliban says we want a withdrawal of all international forces. Others say the same. I think, honestly, it's not in the interest of any of us to see that happen. You need some kind of element of stability, which does not mean that I'm talking about the more long-term future, but at least the next few years. Then what we need to see is, obviously, that the Afghan national security forces are trained, equipped, developed the way we've said. Now, what I see and what I feel is that this is a moving target. We started by talking about 400,000. All of us knew that that was almost unachievable because it's unsustainable. 400,000 security forces. Then it dropped to 350,000 around. And now I sense that there is a discussion of a further reduction. And it was mentioned also by the NATO Secretary General a few days ago. Further reduction, then to what kind of level are we talking? I don't know. I'm not part of that discussion. But it has to be strong enough to be effective, but not that big that it's unsustainable. Of course, the international community is not going to pay for this for a long period of time. The Afghans will have to be able to pay for it. That means also that we have to see to it that economic development happens, that we do invest in projects and programs that can enable the Afghans to pay, not only for that, but for health, education, and so on. And I do fear a situation where if we don't switch to that kind of programs and at the same time withdraw our assistance, or our assistance is gradually built down, then we will end up in a situation where we're not able to pay neither for the security forces nor for these other programs. Is that a likely scenario? It's perhaps the worst case scenario, but it's not a scenario that is excluded. It could happen. And that's certainly something that I would warn very strongly against. And I do believe that, so when I talk about that kind of economic activity, I'm referring to agriculture, to industrial development, infrastructure. It is doable. It's doable. Infrastructure costs money, but I do believe that with the resources that we've spent there for other things, we should be able to do that also. And as you've seen over the last few months, there's more and more talk about the resources that Afghanistan has. I think Afghanistan is the largest iron ore, have the largest iron ore deposits in Asia. Significant copper, petrochemical probably, lithium, etc., etc., etc. So there are vast prospects here if they can be extracted and if the infrastructure can be put in place. And if also we can reach a situation where there is a sufficient level of cooperation with the neighboring countries, because these resources have to get out of Afghanistan somewhere on one side or the other. But yes, it is doable. We have to overcome our current thinking, what has been our current thinking, and also some of the rivalries in the region. Civilian voices and their role. I think we have tried to promote civil society, for instance, not to the extent that we should, and more certainly could be invested in it. in different kinds of organizations within the field of human rights, not only human rights, in the private economic sector also, which I think is important in order to have the economy going. For the international community is a little bit difficult in some areas. I tried to support, for instance, women's networks, but I could not participate in the debate, the public debate, in the way I wanted, because I would be seen as an infidel in a discussion among Afghans. And Afghanistan is a rather conservative society, or I say very conservative society, and I could easily be misused. But we did try to support these kind of organizations to the best of our abilities and within these kind of limits. And I think we also engaged on human rights issues that were important. The most prominent for me and most important for me was the release of a journalist who was sentenced to death originally and then to 20 years, and who we managed to have released and granted amnesty by the president. And here I must say the president worked very well with us throughout the whole process. And one person who was here in the room until recently, a young Norwegian diplomat, was one of those most engaged in the international community to solve that case. But we could do more. And when we speak to some of the Afghans, they say, well, civil society is not all these new NGOs you're talking about, you know. Civil society is the old structures, tribal structures, the religious structures, etc., etc. And both have to be paid attention to. And perhaps we have not done enough with regard to Afghan NGOs. I do think that international NGOs should partner up better with some of them, stimulate them, provide resources of various kinds. There has been, I'm afraid in some instances, a little bit of a competitive market between international and local NGOs. That certainly should come to an end. And we should understand that just as within the government sector, also in the non-governmental sector, there has to be a transfer to the Afghans.
Okay, I know we had one question up here in the front and then in the back.
Paranyan Nazari from the Center on International Cooperation. And my question is about reconciliation with the Taliban. I am from Afghanistan, and there are a lot of things that I worry about in the context of reconciliation. And my fears come from how much has the Taliban changed from the time they governed Afghanistan in the late 90s to the present, and how are they now? How much have they changed? With the Taliban who are involved in talks, are there ways that they have changed in the way they treated women, in the way they treated education? What would happen to the future of transnational justice in Afghanistan, systems that are already fragile? What will happen to that if we also bring the Taliban on board, given that the Taliban are they announced victory in there just a few days ago, and they are holding really tightly onto not accepting the constitution right now, and then they are holding on to their own interpretation of Sharia law in Afghanistan. And they are talking to the US, which among the Afghan people, it might raise the fear of a deal making between the Taliban and the US and the international community in a state of national reconciliation between the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan. So within all these fears, I want to see what is the solution that can see how much the Taliban have changed now, and how reconciliation can address these problems in Afghanistan. Thank you.
All the way in the back.
Graham Usher, Al-Ahram weekly newspaper. I'd just like to ask, what is your opinion of the importance of the relationship between Pakistan and India in the coming period. I was based in Pakistan for a number of years, and it was always seen pretty clearly that Pakistan and India had shifted their proxy war away from Kashmir and onto Afghanistan in the period of the last 10 years, with Pakistan's obvious support for the Taliban, but also India's support for the Karzai government, and also to some extent for their support for the old Northern Alliance factions. How important is a reconciliation between Pakistan and India on Afghanistan to the future? And how important is it for Pakistan and India to help forge a national consensus within Afghanistan about the way ahead?
Go ahead.
My name is Mehmet Kalyoncu, and I'm with the OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Ambassador, I guess we all agree that today what we call Taliban is the children of early 1990s. And we can say that the problem is largely the result from the failure to pay attention to the education of those children. So in terms of especially primary and secondary education, what is the situation in Afghanistan today? Can we expect to have the same results 15 or 20 years from now? Thank you.
How much has the Taliban changed? I don't know. But we have to find out. And you know, all your fears about that are linked to a process, I share them. But that does not mean that we should abstain from trying to move down that process. And I hope and I believe that we have the strength not to enter into some kind of slippery slope where we start negotiating and then abandon things that are important to us and even more important to the Afghan people. But I discussed this quite a lot also with many of the reformers in Afghanistan, men and women. And I always end up with the same conclusion from my side at least. Yes, I see the risks, but I don't see the alternative. So I think we just have to try to face the risks, understand what we're doing, and do our best to obtain a result that corresponds to how we want to see Afghanistan's future. Deal making between the Taliban and the US, I don't think that's a realistic scenario. I think there is more than enough wisdom in Washington to avoid that kind of development, really. I do think also that the US, of course, wants the Afghan government involved. But I think it's important if they now, and I say big if they now move into some kind of process, that this isn't insisted upon, since it has to be an Afghan process. Now, you mentioned something wider. You mentioned transitional justice. And that is something that I regret we have not paid more attention to already from the outset, because we talked about stability rather than justice. Stability was more important than justice. So what happened? We allowed the warlords to move back into positions. We allowed them to be wealthier. As I said, we paid them respect. We entered into contracts with them. It's fairly disappointing. Fairly disappointing. And we are today in a situation where, after the presidential election, Karzai is more dependent on the warlords and power brokers than he was before. The process of bringing reformers into the government stagnated, and in fact, to some extent, went in the other direction after the presidential election. That worries me a lot. And I do think it's a pity. I was sitting down with a former minister, a reformer, some months ago, and he said, I remember during the first jirgas that we had in the early part of the last decade, I was sitting there and I saw these old warlords and the power brokers on the first row, and I thought, it's only a matter of time now before they are marginalized And we are there in the front row, we reformers. And said, today, I wonder if we are marginalized, the reformers. It's a very legitimate question, very legitimate question. And I must say, when it comes to the role of women, etc., let's be honest about this. Yes, the Taliban has a history of abuse. So do some of these other people that we are operating with today, that we relied on and continue to rely on. I think that's serious. The impact of the Pakistan-Indian conflict, now we're moving outside of the box, so to speak, becoming more demanding. It's quite obvious that an improvement in Indian-Pakistani relations would also have an impact on a peace process in Afghanistan. That much is quite obvious. But even in the absence of a rapprochement between Delhi and Pakistan, you have to move forward. You have to do your utmost to move forward in a peace process. But it is, of course, it is interesting when we talk sometime about their region. And we talk about the region around Afghanistan. Well, that region in a way doesn't exist. It's a South Asia region covering India, Pakistan that reaches into Afghanistan. There is a Gulf region that comes up to Iran and touches into Afghanistan. And there's a Central Asian region that does the same. All these three regions cover, in one way or another, Afghanistan. For all the neighboring countries, Afghanistan is a security concern, but not their primary security concern. Not for any of them. And that illustrates, I think, the complexity of the situation. The third question, what was that? Education. Education. I don't know if I quite got what you want.
Could you take the mic again? Thank you.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
Can you hear?
Yep.
I was basically saying that all the problems today are largely caused by the failure to pay due attention to the education of children in early 1990s. So what is the situation in terms of especially primary and secondary school education of Afghan children? Thank you.
I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that's really one of the, I would characterize as success stories. When, at least a year and a half ago, 7 million kids in school, 1/3 girls, that's astonishing. During the Taliban years, there was less than 1 million, I think around 500,000 in school altogether, and almost no women. You have 10 universities, had one or none during Taliban. So there, I must say, a decisive progress has been made. And it is one of those elements that give us hope for the future. One is the natural wealth that is there, and the other is the education, and the third is the media revolution. Altogether, I believe, are important positive developments. Of course, we're far from where we want to be. I think there's still 47% of kids who should be at school that are not at school. That's quite a lot. But I would like to build on your question and say, we must not only pay attention to the primary school and secondary school. I think next year, around 600,000 kids will graduate from secondary school. 600,000. There's only university places for 60,000 of them. And there is professional education places for 30,000 of them. 4% or something, 5%. That's all. Which means that we really have to look at the education sector in a much more holistic way. We have to have an education strategy that embraces higher education, professional education, so that we can make use of all these young people that are better educated, continue educating them, and provide the kind of people we want for a future Afghan labor market. We're far from that. We concentrated tremendously on bringing little girls and little boys to school, and that's important. But now comes the next step, and it's urgent, because if we cannot take more than 100,000 of the 600,000 in 2013, then we're in trouble. So we have to look at these other parts of the educational structures.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Kai. Thank all of you for participating. We're out of time. And I want to thank you especially for answering all the questions. Thank you.